everybody. Before I say everything, I want to apologize terribly for being late unintentionally due to technical problems. So without any further delay, I'm going to shoot out and start our talk for today. Today we are going to talk about a very interesting topic, which is areas in themes and translation studies, a lantern shown into the dark maze of tunnels excavated by translation students and researchers. So this webinar is intended to be a guide for students or researchers in the field of translation studies. And we know that translation studies is considered to be recent addition to the field of applied linguistics, and it is a rough and rugged terrain to cross. So it is considered as uncharted terrain, which is hard to venture into. So we consider and we say that it is hard, really, because doing research in translation studies is an area which, because of its interdisciplinary nature, can present the inexperienced researcher with a bewildering array of topics. So it has many roots running deep in many different areas of studies. That's why we call it interdisciplinary field of study. Now, as you see here, we have two key words in this first opening line, which is translation studies, and we define it as a field of study devoted to describing, analyzing, and theorizing the process, context, and products of translation. And by the way, this term was first introduced by a person called John Holmes in 1972 in his seminal paper, which was presented at the Third International Conference of Applied Linguistics in Copenhagen, Denmark. Although it was later developed by Eugene Nida in 1975. And John Holmes is credited with drawing up a schema for translation studies in which he divided translation studies into pure and applied translation studies. If we move on, then we have research, which we can define, or one of its main definitions could be systematic investigation towards increasing the sum of knowledge. So there is a prerequisite, there is an important sine qua non, which is to add something to contribute to the knowledge of this field of this subject matter. Now, aim of translation studies is to make a contribution to the field in a number of ways. Now, it is also very important to keep in mind that it is hard, if not impossible, to appreciate the thought process of translation, choices, constraints, and mechanisms involved in translation if you've never been engaged in the process yourself. So we cannot expect that a person who has never translated a word to be doing research in translation studies. Now, how can contribution be made in the field of translation studies? We have four different ways. First, by providing a new data. Second, by suggesting an answer to a specific question. Third, by testing or refining an existing hypothesis, theory, or methodology. And the last one, by proposing a new idea, hypothesis, theory, or methodology. So we have four major dichotomies under which your research areas of interest might be grouped. Next, we have the factors which usually launch the drive for doing translation research, because we know that doing research is always determined and governed by some factors. Some of these could be a piqued sense of natural curiosity. Second, a need to obtain a further qualification. Third, general desire for personal development. And these areas of interest. Now, one of the first steps you will need to take is to identify a general area which interests you. So you must have a tendency or a propensity towards working on a certain area, because not all people would like, for example, to work on the same field or aspect in translation studies. So the initial half-baked idea is exciting. This is great. But now we have many questions that need to be kept in mind, and we need to think about them very carefully. But what if the ideas that you've come up with, perhaps someone has already researched it? That's possible. Or perhaps it's not feasible, or perhaps it's not worth researching. And to answer these questions, you need to ascertain the current state of research in the field. And this is carried out by reading more and more and by searching for specific areas which are of interest to you. So the reasons why the previous questions are essential lie in the following points. Now, first, the purpose of research is to add to the sum of knowledge, as we mentioned in the definition. So reinventing the wheel is a waste of everyone's time. You cannot just be repeating what others said, literally. Your research does not take place in a vacuum. It relates to what has gone before, and this is what we call, what we refer to as literature review or previous studies. But in all cases, at any rate, even if you consider that everything written on your topic to date is rubbish, you still must be able to substantiate, to support this opinion and justify your own approach. Now, today I'm going to show you that how the research process is made up of a number of stages. I'm not going to read them all one by one, but these are all the stages, but we are not going to go through all of them. We're just going to talk about choosing an area. I would just want to open a window of your mind to the areas around you to work on. And this merely is intended to provide a point of orientation, just to provide a shower of sparks to ignite or kindle your curiosity. Now, an overview of some research areas in translation studies. Of course, this list is by no means exhaustive. So we still have much more beyond that. But I'm just going to introduce to you the most important areas in translation studies. And you might take any one of them as the thread to go after or to pull, to furl and weave into much more good or much more beautiful fabric. Now, first, under text analysis and translation, we know that text analysis and translation is a subject which is taught in the first level on our MA program. Under this subject matter, we have many areas of interest in translation studies. Like, for example, first we have source text analysis, and in this type, the analysis it involves analysis of source text itself. It examines its various aspects that may bring about translation problems. So this has relevance to translation training. So after careful analysis of the syntactic, semantic, or stylistic features of the source text, it's presumably easier to come up with adequate translation solutions. And as I told my students, no problems, no need for translation theory. 2, comparison of translations and their source text translations. Here we have here it involves the textual comparison of translation with its original. So a translation tries to compare. It is a kind of comparison which deals with several translations, Of course, because every possible aspect of the text cannot be dealt with, then we have to be particularly focusing on a certain aspect which must be chosen to be kept in focus. Like, for example, to discuss or to shed light on certain stylistics or syntactic features, or to examine and then to examine the corresponding sections in translations. Or we could start with a kind of translation problems, like, for example, translation of dialects. Whoever stopped and paused at this topic, or allusions or metaphors, and see how translations solved them, what strategies were followed by the translator. So here the aim is to discover patterns of correspondence between the texts. And this involves forms of contrastive text analysis and contrastive stylistics. Now, the third one is very interesting. It is translation with commentary, or what we call annotated translation. And this is usually considered to be the project of graduation for our students on the MA program in their fourth level. And it is considered to be a form of introspective and retrospective research, where you yourself translate a text, and at the same time, you yourself write a commentary on your own translation process. Now, however, it is very important to stop here at the word, for example, introspective. Introspective analysis means that you carry out a self-analysis of your own thought process, whereas retrospective takes place after the task is completed. So here we need to understand that the commentary here will include some discussion of the translation assignment, and this involves an analysis of the aspects of the source text first, and you provide reasoned justifications of the type of solutions you arrived at for certain translation problems. And by the way, by this, the contribution in this field is to raise the self-awareness to the translation quality. Translation commentary aims to assess, so these are the criteria on which people need to lean on when they evaluate or assess a translation commentary by our students. We have categories of assessment: aims, knowledge, abilities to, skills and awareness, and the detailed assessment aims. So what each comes under, for example, under knowledge, we have to check, or this is intended to check the students' awareness of translation theories. Under abilities, here we need to see how theories are combined and harmoniously put together, reflect, etc. So as you see, it is not totally subjective. We have a lot of standard criteria that needs to be kept in mind. By the way, I can refer our students to go to, for example, Bly 1984, which is a useful commentary where he tried to describe in detail the stages he went through during translating a poem. Now, how is it usually carried out? We are still talking about translation with commentary or annotated translation, and we know that our students, which have been studying under the supervision of our experienced colleagues, know that, but it is just for those who are not studying this. It is, we consider to be one form of dissertations, and it can take the form of a piece of a critical writing. This is the commentary, informed by students' own. Usually, we go for literary translation into Arabic or English because it explores the aesthetic features employed by researchers. The translation will be included in the body of the dissertation and will count towards the word limit. Now, the overall shape of the piece of work should still be that of a conventional dissertation, so it should begin by introducing and justifying the translation project, providing any necessary contextualization for the reader. Now, the translation should be included in the body of the dissertation at an appropriate point. So it is not in the index, for example. The dissertation must not fall into two halves only, because the reader then has no sense of what sort of translation has been done and why. The aim of the commentary is to affect how the translation is read, and just as will be the case in the conventional dissertation, the order of the text, which includes the positioning, of the translation should be shaped by the argument being made. So you have to keep in mind certain arguments that you want to agree for, or you oppose when you try to provide an annotated translation. We move to the second area in the translation studies. It is translation quality assessment. And here translations are assessed in real life in many circumstances, like, for example, during training, in exams for official certifications by critics and reviewers. And I can add that we can distinguish three major approaches to translation quality assessment. And the major reference for that is Julian House in the 1950s and the 1990s. So we have first source-oriented study, which is based on the relationships between the translation and its source text. And we have target language oriented translation, and here equivalence is not a central point, but we try to analyze and assess the difference between the translations in questions and other comparable texts in target language. And here we try to see or to assess or to measure the translator's degree of naturalness in conveying the message. The last point, or number 3, is assessment of translation effects on clients, teachers, critics, and of course, if they meet readers' expectations. Next, we have genre translation. And under this here, we have literary genres such as drama, poetry, and prose fiction, as well as other established and clearly defined types of text for translation, such as multimedia text, which is now growing rapidly. We have religious texts, children's literature, tourism text, technical text, and legal documents. Of course, we know that our students study technical translation, legal translation, Islamic translation, which can be considered to be subsumed under religious texts. But here, it's very important to stop, for example, to talk about the drama, for example. Among the first questions to address here when you want to translate a drama or a play, is the play being translated has been written to be performed or read? This is a very important question. Are you going to translate that to be read or to be performed on stage? And if it is to be performed, what sort of translation is required? Is it just a rough translation as a starting point for the production, or a fully performable one, or something in between? Again, if we go, for example, to talk about the prose fiction translation, this is the field where, by the way, most full-time literary translators earn their living. They translate literary works and live on that money. So it's very important here, for example, to select one aspect due to the impossibility to research the totality of a novel or a short story or whatever, like, for example, the narrative perspective of the author, translator, and translation of dialogues, handling of what we call CPI, cultural specific items, or translation of a humor, for example, as we see in Najib Mahfouz or other novels. So if we move on, we have multimedia translation, and this is extremely important because it's a new addition compared to other types of translations. We have audiovisual texts, which are primarily spoken texts, like on radio, on TV programs, films, and theater, which are translated by revoicing or subtitling. And by the way, the first important volume written on this was written in the year 1957 by Lax, and it was in French, and it was Le Seu titrage des films. It was it discussed subtitling. Now we have revoicing, which means it's the replacement of the original spoken text with a translation in the target language, or what we call dablaja. And we have subtitling, which leaves, or what we call tarjama sam'iyya basariya, which leaves the original spoken or sung text intact, and you just add a written translation on screen. If we move on, we have evaluating software. This is also a new addition to translation studies in terms of areas of research. Here, the evaluation of this software can take the form of a small scale or large scale research project. And this is usually heavily relying on language engineering, because they are producing more and more software for machine translations and computer-assisted translation machines, etc. Okay, so here, for example, we can take a machine translation package and we use it, and we discuss the output of the translation given as an input first, like, for example, telegraph or other packages used for translations. Next, evaluation can be quite complicated here because you need to establish clearly formulated criteria, and as we mentioned, it is deeply involved in computer engineering. Interpreting, this is very important, and our students study simultaneous interpreting. Here, one distinction concerns the mode of interpreting. Is it simultaneous or consecutive? But also we have other classification which is concerned with the social situation where interpreting is needed, such as conference interpreting, which is usually simultaneous, and it is usually in one direction, and we call it monodirection. And we have liaison interpreting or liaison interpreting, and we call it sometimes dialogue or community interpreting, usually bidirectional. And the third one is court interpreting, usually bidirectional. And we know that under consecutive and simultaneous, simultaneous has never been found before the Second World War. It is just after the World War that we started to see simultaneous interpreting mode. But before that, we just had consecutive. And by the way, in many cases, consecutive is the prevailing and dominant mode of interpreting. Now, the following is a list of research topics grouped under the following headings. For example, under cognitive studies, we have neurophysiological studies of the interpreter's brain in action. And this is very interesting, and is not designed for beginners in this field. We have also functioning of memory in simultaneous interpreting, and many of my colleagues know that many people really died under the pressure of providing simultaneous interpreting. Effect of time lag on the final quality of the interpretation. Under behavioral studies, we have note-taking techniques, which is usually used in consecutive interpreting, because in simultaneous you don't have time to take notes. Studies of the strategies interpreters use to prepare for the task. And we have studies of how interpreters cope with particular problems, such as speakers' unusual form of delivery, unusual time constraints, and unusual stress conditions. Eye contact between the interpreter and other participant. This is very important, and in many cases we consider consecutive interpreters to be working as bicultural facilitators or mediators between the two languages. So this is just a real page taken showing some notes taking in consecutive interpreting. Under linguistic studies, we have how interpreters tend to render various kinds of structures under certain conditions, what and when interpreters tend to omit or condense, and style shifts during interpreting. For example, do interpreters tend to gravitate towards a neutral style, even when their speakers are using a more formal or informal register? Can, for example, the style of or the pace of speech, should it be reflected in the translation or in the interpreting? All these are points which are worth examining and exploring. So the last part is interpreter training. For example, here we have comparative studies of professional and trainee interpreters working under similar conditions, or of naive and trained interpreters. So we compare professional and inexperienced translators, or for example, professors and their students, and we see how they tackle the text and how they deal with certain chunks or stretches of language in translation. We have then comparative studies of how interpreters are trained in different institutions. For example, people trained in London, for example, do they receive the same training received, for example, in Vienna or in Stockholm, Denmark, etc.? All these are open for exploration. So thank you very much for your time. Again, I do extend my sincerest apologies for being late today, and I hope you would forgive me. Thank you very much, and I'll give you the floor for any questions to be asked. Thank you.
Thank you so much indeed, Dr. Eyhab, for your nice, lively, interesting, and informative presentation. And you successfully covered a lots of interesting points relevant to translation studies and theories. So now, as usual, the floor goes to the audience. Do you have any questions or comments? Thank you. Yes, please. The participants, you can ask a question or make a comment.
I'm not sure if there are any participants still
yes,
waiting.
Yes, a recording I can email Dr. Eyhab. He
Yes.
will send you in, no problem.
Okay.
Anyone, please? We still have a lot of time, I think. The session, I edited actually the session timing, and 12:30 you can continue. We can continue up to 12:30. Any questions, please? Or a comment? Okay, you're texting, no problem.
All right. Okay, so if there are no questions, okay, I have nothing to add but to thank you for your waiting today, to which I'm really indebted, and I repeat again my apologies. I had to rush to the office to provide it. So thank you very much.
So thank you again, Dr. Eyhab. Nice, it was a very nice presentation, and Alhamdulillah, you managed to present.
Thank you very much for your understanding and cooperation, and for any questions that might come up later, you can contact me. Thank you very much.
Inshallah. So thank you very much again, and all of you, for attending the seminar, webinar, and with a lot of patience. And there's one session left, inshallah, and it is supposed to be in 2 weeks' time, inshallah. You're all invited, and that's going to be the last one before Ramadan. I think we'll finish. We'll wrap up everything. Thank you so much again. Until then, goodbye. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you.